with regard to this particular topic, this single most important political issue in the United Kingdom of the last 10 years. I don't know how to get back into it, but I do know this. There's a line in the coverage today that makes my blood run cold. It really does. I mean, even now, the governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, has to say that while Britain's recent performance was not a good story, and that while he took a neutral position on Brexit, he must point out consequences. So even now, deploying objectivity and expertise, the governor of the Bank of England, whose job is exclusively economics, feels that he can't come out and be non-neutral. This is like trying to be neutral about rainwater in a flood, or trying to be neutral. Well, I don't even know what the best analogy is. I've usually got analogies coming out of my ears. Circumstances in which being neutral is absurd stroke obscene. Not because of opinion, but because of observable fact. Observable facts that it is his job not only to determine and disclose, but also, of course, to dissect and deal with. There's a nice little early hello to the alliteration fans listening to the programme. Not only to disclose, but also to dissect and deal with. And I still don't quite get it. So the topic I haven't quite nailed down, because the things that don't usually work during our time together every day are the things that are a little bit too speculative and too theoretical. You know, what do you... I think there's only one thing worse than me saying to you, what do you think is going to happen in the future? Than the only thing worse than that is me saying, what's your opinion about this thing that might happen in the future? Some phone-ins can work like that, but they don't really butter my parsnips because it all seems a little bit pointless. But the more evidence is accrued, the more important it becomes to ask, how is this dam going to break? How is it going to happen? Have a little listen to some of what Andrew Bailey said last night. I'll remind you again, he's the governor of the Bank of England, and he believes it is still beholden upon him to take a neutral position on the thing that he's talking about here.
I take no position on Brexit per se, and that's very important. But I do have to point out consequences. The changing trading relationship with the EU has weighed on the level of potential supply. The impact on trade seems to be more in goods than services, which I don't think is particularly surprising. But it underlines why we must be alert to and welcome opportunities to rebuild relations while respecting that very important decision of the British people.
I mean, in a way, the question I want to ask is can you, you know? City Hall commissioned one report showing that London's economy alone has shrunk by 30 billion, and that was a couple of years ago. So does he have to keep a neutral position on Brexit? Why does he have to keep a neutral position on Brexit? And how is this dam going to break? Because break it must. That's gravity. It has to. I don't know, which one of those do you like most? I listen to it again, actually, okay, because I think we're going to go in on these words, because the governor of the Bank of England is quite a big cheese. He is a grandish fromage under any measure, right? And he's talking about the British economy, and he is acknowledging the crippling effects of voting in 2016 to remove ourselves from the single largest trading bloc on the planet. It's not his job to talk about bogus interpretations of what sovereignty means. It's not his job to pretend that because services are doing well-ish, relatively speaking, Brexit somehow becomes a good idea. He speaks very coolly about the relationship between those two things. If you're confused by it, just think about what relationship technology has with borders. So if I'm advising you on something, or if I'm doing transactions for you, I don't have to be in your country. If I'm trying to import or export something, then I do. So that's why services and goods are and we're always going to be two very different phenomena in this field. So it's not his job to wang on ignorantly about sovereignty. It's not his job to talk about the will of the people, who of course were hideously and criminally misled. It's not his job to keep the balloon of Brexit bloviation inflated in the way that Boris Johnson was required to do. It's not his job to pretend that there's some mythical Brexit, but it goes to a different school, as lots of people who voted for it are still reduced to pretending. It's not his job to do any of these things. It is his job to maximise the performance of our economy, to make the financial health of this country as robust as it can possibly be. So why does he still think he has to be neutral on the biggest issue of our time?
I take no position on Brexit per se, and that's very important. But I do have to point out consequences. The changing trading relationship with the EU has weighed on the level of potential supply. The impact on trade seems to be more in goods than services, which I don't think is particularly surprising. But it underlines why we must be alert to and welcome opportunities to rebuild relations while respecting that very important decision of the British people.
Okay, I've got another question now. So the first question is, does he really have to remain neutral? 0345 6060 973. And of course, if you ring in and say yes, I'll say why. 0345 6060 973. People who know a little bit more about it perhaps than I do. How about the question of whether or not he's talking twaddle? Is there anything at all meaningful to be gained from that tinkering around the edges that he describes, respecting the result of 2016 when, half the country voted for something that is, we now know, provably impossible? I mean, that's a great question. Does he have to retain neutrality because of that? But is there anything meaningful to be achieved in the context of tinkering around the edges, in the context of trying to rebuild relations? Well, I mean, if I were to go back to my favourite analogy of the whole Brexit period, I would go to the sports club. So you are a member of a sports club. You are told by people like Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson that you can leave the sports club and not only retain full access to all of the facilities and the shower, but also somehow get free membership of all the other sports clubs in the world as well. So that without paying anything. So that's what they told you. If you take the sports club analogy now, you have surrendered your membership. You found out you can't go back in again, ever. Every time you try and go through the turnstiles, they've started calling security. Oh, this is outrageous. I've left my towel in my locker. I don't care, sir. You're no longer a member of the sports club. You cannot. I only want 10 minutes on the running machine. I'm terribly sorry, sir. You are no longer a member of the sports club. You can't come. But I was told, I was promised that you needed me more than I needed you. I was told categorically by Boris Johnson that you needed me more than I needed you. So I voted to leave. Now you need me. I'm terribly sorry, sir, but we don't. We'd love to welcome you back in again. Here's an application form. It's 768 pages long and is unlikely to contain membership terms comparable to the ones that you had before you left. Herbert. So, what's the analogy here? Hello, I don't want to rejoin, but I wonder whether I could possibly have 10 minutes in the sauna. Do you see what I mean? I don't know enough to answer this question. But if there is something doable, what is it? 0345 6060 973. So, is it necessary for him to take no position on Brexit? As Thor points out, that is itself an inherently political reason, and it is a statement, and it is articulated entirely for political reasons. The Governor of the Bank of England is still frightened of the Daily Mail. The Governor of the Bank of England is still frightened of the Daily Telegraph. So he nibbles at the edges of the truth, but insists that he cannot say it out loud because he doesn't want to be on the front page of a mass-selling newspaper, essentially being treated like a judge in 1930s Germany, or indeed a judge in 2016 by Paul Dacre. Enemies of the people, crush the saboteurs. Hey, you can have some sympathy for him in that position, but someone's going to have to grow a pair soon in that kind of job. I take no position on Brexit, but it's bloody awful. It's mad, right? Absolutely bonkers. Unless, of course, it isn't. In which case, I want you to tell me why you think that it is right for the Governor of the Bank of England to pretend or adopt, whatever you prefer, a neutral position on Brexit. And I also want you to tell me whether or not there is any mileage in this so-called rebuilding of relations while respecting the vote. Because I think the reason I haven't nailed this down as a topic, I think the reason it doesn't quite fly yet, is because there isn't. There's no sort of Brexit light. I presume Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer know this. There's no kind of, oh, well, this is almost as good as being a member, but not quite. Unless you join the single market or the customs union. But, of course, the single market certainly entails adopting the 4 freedoms, including freedom of movement. So I don't think there is such a thing. I just don't think that Andrew Bailey is describing reality to you when he talks about the need to restore relations. And who is qualified to tell us what that might look like? I don't know. So what do you think about this notion of neutrality even now? It's a bit like, King Canute sitting on the beach, and I know the proper story of King Canute, don't at me. He's sitting on the beach and the tide comes in, and one of his advisors says, well, I still have to adopt a position of neutrality on whether or not the king can stop the tide from coming in. So King Canute goes to the beach, you know this story, to prove to his barons that he's not omnipotent. He wants to prove to them that he can't do everything. He's kind of like the opposite of Donald Trump. He sits on the beach in his big old throne, and the tide is coming in, and he goes, halt! Halt the tides! And the tides carry on coming in. And he turns to all his barons and he goes, see? I told you I wasn't omnipotent. I told you I wasn't all-powerful. To his enormous, I presume, enormous annoyance, for the rest of history, the story is told the other way round, as if he honestly thought he could stop the tides coming in. But that's not what happened. Imagine if you're standing next to King Canute. You're the governor of the Bank of England. King Canute has just tried to stop the tides coming in. The tides are washing around your ankles, and the governor of the Bank of England goes, I must still retain a position of neutrality on this subject and respect the vote of the people who voted for the tides never to come in again. They're in. Make sense of it for me, please.